Picture this. It's 1856, just after the Lunar New Year. Firecrackers are still scattered across the streets. In a muddy market in Guangxi province, China, a barefoot French priest is being dragged through the crowd. He's got a heavy wooden board locked around his neck like some kind of human wanted poster. 3 days later, his body, beaten, caged, and headless, is tossed outside the city walls. When the news hits Europe, the papers go wild. They scream that China has served up death by 1,000 cuts to an innocent missionary. Paris seizes on the story, and within months, warships are steaming up the Pearl River, ready for a fight. But was it really the infamous Lingchi, that slow, slicing execution? Or was it just a convenient horror story for a war Europe was already itching to fight? The truth is messier, darker, and its echoes are still heard in every shouting match between China and the West today. The priest's name was Auguste Chapdelaine, and he was no movie-style hero. He grew up on a farm in Normandy, didn't even make it to the seminary until he was 30, and spent his nights studying Chinese characters by candlelight while everyone else slept. In 1852, he secretly slipped into Guangxi province. This was a dangerous move. The region was being torn apart by the massive Taiping rebellion and was deeply suspicious of foreigners. Officially, missionaries were confined to just 5 port cities. Chapdelaine basically ignored that rule, swapped his priest's robes for peasant clothes, and started hiking from village to village. He preached to people who were so poor they'd just sold their children to pay the taxman. Some locals called him the bearded teacher. The local magistrates called him an illegal agitator. Both descriptions were kind of true, which made him the perfect scapegoat when things got tense. On February 25, 1856, 40 Qing constables kicked in the door of a small chapel in the town of Shilin. Inside, Chapdelaine was baptizing 2 women by candlelight. The official charge? Plotting rebellion and seducing good people with foreign doctrine. In 19th century China, both of those could get you the death penalty. They also arrested his local assistant and a teenage convert who was just holding some hymn sheets. The officials waved around so-called coded letters as proof. They were actually just Latin prayers. Within hours, the priest was in chains and marched to the local government office. He refused to pay the usual bribe that often got foreigners out of trouble. He insisted that preaching Christianity wasn't a crime. That decision sealed his fate. Now, here's where the story gets twisted. European tabloids printed gruesome illustrations of Chapdelaine tied to a post, being sliced to ribbons by an executioner. But French naval surgeons who later examined reports told a different, though still horrifying, story. He was repeatedly flogged with bamboo. Then, they locked him in a kang, that heavy wooden collar I mentioned, which pinned his neck and wrists. After that, they forced him into a small iron cage, the kind designed so you can't stand up or lie down, and hung it outside the prison gate for the public to mock. The nights in Guangxi in February are cold, and it was raining. For 3 straight days, guards would poke him with poles to keep him from sleeping. On the morning of the 4th day, he was dead from exposure, his injuries, and exhaustion. He was broken, but his body was mostly intact. The local prefect then ordered a post-mortem beheading. His head was placed on a spike above the city's south gate as a warning. There was no ritual slicing, no 1,000 cuts. Lingchi was reserved for high-profile traitors and was often done after death anyway. The cage was simply a cheaper, faster, and still terrifying way to execute someone. News of his death eventually traveled downriver to Canton, where France's representative, Baron Gros, was looking for a reason to act. Paris was already planning to pressure China for new trade rights, and the blood of a martyr was public relations gold. Gros mailed the sensationalized reports to Emperor Napoleon III, along with a silk cord he claimed was from the cage. Within weeks, French newspapers were calling Chapdelaine the butchered saint. Pamphlets claimed his heart had been ripped out and offered to idols. The public outrage gave the French government the moral cover it needed to send 12 warships and 4,000 troops to China. Britain, already angry over a separate incident involving a ship called the Arrow, eagerly joined in. Welcome to the Second Opium War. Before we get to the war itself, if you find these forgotten corners of history fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We drop a new deep dive every week into the events that shaped our world. All right, back to the war you probably skipped in history class. In late 1857, French and British guns bombarded Canton. They captured the very same official who had approved the priest's detention and paraded him in a cage through the streets of Calcutta in India. The Allied forces moved north, capturing forts, and soon Beijing itself was threatened. The Qing court fled the capital. The war ended with the 1860 Convention of Peking. This treaty legalized Christianity across the entire Chinese empire. But it also contained deep humiliations for China, things still taught in schools there today. It forced open new cities to foreign trade and allowed British and French troops to loot and burn the magnificent old summer palace to the ground. Chapdelaine's death became a footnote, but his name was written into the treaty in a different way. Missionaries were now legally allowed to buy land anywhere in China. One man's death in a small iron cage had helped redraw the map of an empire. Over time, two completely opposite stories about Chapdelaine emerged. Catholic writers portrayed him as a fearless shepherd. In 1900, people who claimed to be witnesses remembered him sharing his last bit of rice with fellow prisoners and humming hymns through his split lips. In the year 2000, Pope John Paul II made him a saint. Meanwhile, Chinese state textbooks painted a very different picture. They called him an imperialist spy who assaulted local women and stockpiled weapons. But independent historians have found no credible evidence for these claims. They seem to have appeared decades later as propaganda. The facts are the same: an illegal missionary, a cage, a head on a spike. But they're used to preach two opposite sermons. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the bruised middle. So why does that death by 1,000 cuts legend stick around? Part of it was a simple mistranslation. Early French interpreters turned the Chinese phrase for executed and publicly exposed into the much more dramatic put to the lingering death. Part of it was sensationalism. Victorians loved reading travel stories filled with exotic and brutal punishments, and editors knew that shocking phrases sell newspapers. The real horror of the cage, combined with the post-mortem beheading, made the Lingchi story sound believable. Even today, death by 1,000 cuts is a common phrase for any slow, painful process. Slap it on a headline about China and watch the clicks roll in. Chapdelaine's story is a masterclass in how horror travels faster than truth, especially when empires are looking for a reason to go to war. History often forgets the people Chapdelaine was trying to serve. After his arrest, the small Christian community he built faced retaliation. Their chapels were torched, and many converts fled into the hills. Today, no plaque marks the spot where he died. The iron cage was likely melted down for scrap metal long ago. His death shows what happens when personal faith collides with global politics. Western powers have a long history of using the suffering of individuals, whether real or exaggerated, to justify their own expansion. At the same time, the Qing officials turned their own panic about foreign influence into a brutal crackdown, a pattern we've seen again and again throughout history. The story is a warning to be skeptical of emotional headlines. Behind every atrocity story is a complex human being who was someone's brother, someone's burden, and in this case, someone's excuse for war. Auguste Chapdelaine didn't die by 1,000 cuts, but a single, sharp narrative did help slice up China's sovereignty. Saint, scapegoat, or spy. His story reminds us that stories, especially the gruesome ones, often travel faster than gunboats. So the next time a headline screams about some far-off cruelty, ask yourself, who's spinning this story and who stands to benefit from your outrage? What's your take? Was France justified in avenging one priest, or did China have the right to deal with an illegal preacher during a civil war? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think, smash that like button and share this video. Thanks for watching.